Deep in the Amazon rainforest, the toughest president in American history is lying in the mud, begging for death. Theodore Roosevelt, the bull moose, the indestructible force of nature, is rotting alive. His leg is black with necrosis. A loaded revolver sits by his side, but in his trembling hand he clutches his true escape, a lethal vial of morphine. Feverish and broken, he implores his son to leave him behind in the jungle to die. This is the untold chronicle of the hellish journey that stripped a titan of his power and turned the unstoppable Theodore Roosevelt into a crippled old man. Theodore Roosevelt was not born a titan, he was born a victim. Entering the world on October the 27th, 1858, Cide, as he was known, was a sickly, fragile defect in a wealthy and vigorous family. He was pale, nervous, and plagued by a stomach that rejected solid food, but his true tormentor was asthma. In the mid-19th century, before the advent of inhalers or steroids, asthma was not merely a condition, it was a nocturnal predator. Night after night, the young boy would wake up drowning in his own body, his airways constricting like a vice, clawing at his throat in a panic as his face turned blue. The psychological toll of this chronic invalidism was immense. He lived in a state of constant low-level terror, watching other children play through the window pane like a specimen in a glass case. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a giant of a man whom the boy worshipped and called Great Heart, would pace the floor for hours with the gasping child in his arms, or wrap him in furs and drive him through the freezing winter streets in a carriage, hoping the shock of cold air would force the lungs open. This created a deep-seated complex in the young Roosevelt, a profound shame of his own physical weakness. He was brilliant, devouring books on biology and history with a photographic memory, but he felt useless, a brain without a body, a disappointment to the father he idolized. He learned early on that the world was a dangerous place and that he was ill-equipped to survive in it. The turning point of his life, the moment that planted the seed for the Amazonian suicide attempt, came when he was 12 years old. His father took him aside and delivered an ultimatum that would define Roosevelt's entire existence. He told the boy, Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It was a command that linked physical strength inextricably with moral worth. A normal child might have crumbled under such pressure, but Theodore radicalized. He declared war on his own biology. He began a regime of physical punishment in the second-floor gymnasium of their home, lifting weights until his arms shook, doing pull-ups until his hands blistered, and hiking for miles until he collapsed. He was building a suit of armor. Layer by muscle, he constructed the persona of TR over the sickly frame of Cide. He went to Harvard and became a spectacle of energy, boxing, rowing, and talking, with a manic machine gun staccato that dominated every room. But this energy was not the calm strength of the naturally fit. It was the frantic, desperate motion of a man running away from a ghost. He was terrified of stillness because in the silence he could still hear the wheezing of the sick boy. He believed that if he stopped moving, the asthma would return, or worse, the irrelevance would swallow him. This fear of returning to the glass case became his hamartia, his fatal flaw. He could never rest, for resting was akin to dying. The armor was tested and hardened by tragedy. In 1884, on Valentine's Day, Roosevelt suffered a biblical catastrophe. In the same house, just hours apart, his mother died of typhoid fever, and his young wife Alice died of kidney failure after giving birth to their daughter. He was 25 years old, and his life had been incinerated. Standing between the two coffins, he drew a thick black X in his diary and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." Instead of grieving in the traditional sense, he did what he had trained himself to do. He fled into physical hardship. He abandoned his political career and went west to the Badlands of the Dakota Territory. For 2 years, he lived the life of a cowboy, brutalizing his body to numb his mind. He rode for days without sleep, hunted buffalo, captured outlaws at gunpoint, and fought in saloons. He called his depression black care, describing it as a dark rider that sat behind him in the saddle. The only way to escape it was to ride faster. This period solidified his belief that physical suffering was the only cure for spiritual pain. He returned to the East transformed, thick-necked, weather-beaten, and seemingly indestructible. He rode this wave of cultivated hypermasculinity through the ranks of power: police commissioner, assistant secretary of the Navy, and eventually the leader of the Rough Riders. His charge up San Juan Hill in 1898 was reckless, a near-suicidal dash into Mauser fire. But for Roosevelt, it was a religious experience, his crowded hour where he finally proved he wasn't the sick boy anymore. When he ascended to the presidency after McKinley's assassination, he brought this manic energy to the White House. For nearly 8 years, he was the center of the world's gravity, breaking trusts, building the Panama Canal, and brokering peace treaties. He was addicted to power, not for the sake of wealth, but because power was the ultimate proof of his vitality. But in 1909, he made a fatal error. He voluntarily relinquished power. He honored a pledge not to run for a third term and handed the presidency to William Howard Taft. He left office at the peak of his popularity, a young man of 50, and immediately felt the withdrawal symptoms of irrelevance. By 1912, the silence of private life had become unbearable. Roosevelt felt that Taft had betrayed his progressive legacy, but more personally, he felt the old demons of boredom and uselessness creeping in. He couldn't stand to be on the sidelines. In a fit of ego and desperation, he broke with tradition and ran against Taft, splitting the Republican Party and forming the Progressive Bull Moose Party. The campaign was a crusade of pure adrenaline. Even when he was shot in the chest by an assassin in Milwaukee, he refused to go to the hospital, delivering a 90-minute speech with a bullet lodged in his rib cage, his shirt soaked in blood. It was the ultimate performance of his invincibility. But the electorate did not reward him. In November 1912, he suffered a humiliating, crushing defeat to Woodrow Wilson. The loss devastated him. It wasn't just a political loss, it was a rejection of his entire identity. The American people had looked at the bull moose and said, "We don't need you anymore." He retreated to Sagamore Hill, sliding into a profound depression. He was 54, overweight, blind in one eye from boxing, and carrying a bullet in his chest. He sat in his study, surrounded by the trophies of his past, feeling the walls closing in. The sick boy in the glass case was back, whispering that he was finished, that he was an old man with nothing left to offer. He needed a cure. He needed to punish himself again. And when the invitation came to explore a mysterious, unmapped river in the Amazon, a river that promised danger, disease, and perhaps death, he didn't see a scientific expedition. He saw a chance for redemption. He saw a place where he could either regain his glory through suffering or find a grave magnificent enough to match his ego. The winter of 1913 descended upon Sagamore Hill, Roosevelt's estate in Oyster Bay, New York, with a silence that was heavier than the snow. For a man whose life had been defined by the roar of crowds, the clang of machinery, and the applause of nations, this silence was not a respite. It was a tomb. Theodore Roosevelt was 54 years old, but in the months following his crushing defeat in the 1912 presidential election, he had aged a decade. The bull moose was no longer charging. He was wounded, cornered, and for the first time in his adult life, he was utterly irrelevant. The American people, whom he had led with such verve for nearly 8 years, had chosen the scholarly, austere Woodrow Wilson. They had effectively told Roosevelt to go home, sit down, and be quiet. Inside the sprawling Victorian home, Roosevelt paced the hallways like a caged tiger. The physical toll of the campaign was beginning to manifest in alarming ways. The assassin's bullet from Milwaukee was still lodged in his chest, encapsulated in bone and scar tissue next to a rib, a constant aching reminder of his mortality. He had gained weight, his once iron-hard frame softening into heaviness. He was blind in his left eye, the result of a boxing injury kept secret during his presidency, and now his good eye was tired. He wrote letters to friends that were uncharacteristically morbid, referring to himself as an old man whose work was done. The depression, that black care he had outridden in the Badlands 30 years prior, was catching up to him. He could hear the hoofbeats of his own melancholy closing in. For a man with Roosevelt's specific psychological architecture, this forced retirement was a form of living death. His entire sense of self-worth was predicated on utility, on being useful, on being in the arena, on being the man with the sword. Without a war to fight or a trust to bust, he felt a creeping sense of emasculation. He was terrified of becoming a historical footnote while he was still breathing. He needed an outlet for the manic energy that still burned beneath the layers of disappointment. He needed a physical struggle to silence the mental anguish. It was in this state of vulnerability and desperation that the invitation to South America arrived, offering a seductive, dangerous escape route. Initially, the trip was proposed as nothing more than a standard diplomatic lecture tour. The governments of Argentina and Brazil invited the famous Colonel Roosevelt to speak on democracy and American progress. It was a safe, respectable itinerary for an elder statesman: grand hotels, state dinners, polite applause, and perhaps a little sightseeing on well-charted rivers. It was the kind of trip a retired man takes to feel important. Roosevelt accepted not out of passion, but out of a need to be anywhere but Oyster Bay. He needed to move. He packed his bags with the grim determination of a man going into exile, but the safe version of the trip was never going to satisfy the hunger gnawing at his soul. As he began to plan, a figure entered the narrative who would act as the catalyst for the disaster to come. Father John Augustine Zahm was a priest from the University of Notre Dame, a man of God with the heart of an adventurer. Zahm had accompanied Roosevelt on previous trips and knew the colonel's thirst for the unknown. He whispered in Roosevelt's ear about the interior of the continent, not the civilized coasts of Rio de Janeiro or Buenos Aires, but the dark, green, unmapped heart of the Amazon basin. He spoke of rivers that ran through the jungle like veins of mystery, places where white men had never set foot. Roosevelt's imagination ignited. The idea of a lecture tour suddenly seemed pedestrian, almost insulting. Why should he? The man who hunted lions in Africa and captured outlaws in the snow be reduced to giving speeches in tuxedos. He seized upon Zahm's suggestion with a fervor that alarmed his family. He didn't want a tour, he wanted an expedition. He wanted to plunge into the wilderness again. He wrote to the American Museum of Natural History, offering to collect specimens. He transformed the trip from a diplomatic mission into a scientific crusade. His wife Edith, a woman of immense strength who usually managed her husband's impulses, felt a deep foreboding. She insisted that their son Kermit accompany him. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that in his current state of mind, Theodore was liable to take risks that were not just reckless, but suicidal. When Roosevelt arrived in Brazil in late 1913, the metamorphosis from diplomat to explorer accelerated. He met Colonel Cândido Rondon, a legendary Brazilian figure who was part soldier, part scientist, and part mystic. Rondon had spent decades laying telegraph lines through the most hostile terrain on Earth. He was a man of iron discipline and indigenous blood, a positivist who believed in order and progress. Rondon looked at the American ex-president and saw a challenge. He didn't offer Roosevelt a simple hunting trip. Instead, he unrolled a map of the Mato Grosso region and pointed to a blank, jagged blue line that twisted into nothingness. This, Rondon told him, is the Rio da Dúvida, the river of doubt. It was a tributary of the Amazon that no civilized man had ever descended. It was a geographical question mark. Nobody knew where it went, how long it was, or what lived along its banks. To descend it would mean traversing 1,000 kilometers of the most dangerous jungle in the world, facing uncontacted cannibalistic tribes, impassable rapids, and lethal diseases. It was a journey that Rondon himself had only contemplated with extreme caution. He offered it to Roosevelt as the ultimate prize, the chance to put his name on the map of the world, to fill in the last great blank spot of the Western Hemisphere. For Roosevelt, this was the bait he couldn't resist. It appealed to his vanity, yes, but more importantly, it appealed to his fatalism. A lecture tour was for a retired politician. Discovering a new river was work for a hero. It was the strenuous life writ large. Despite the frantic warnings of naturalists who told him the expedition was ill-equipped for such a massive undertaking, despite the fact that he was 55 years old and overweight, despite the bullet in his chest, Roosevelt said yes immediately. He didn't just agree to the risk, he embraced it with a disturbing enthusiasm. He told a friend that if he left his bones in South America, it would be a small price to pay for the adventure. This decision marks the true psychological break. The Roosevelt who accepted Rondon's challenge was not thinking about science or geography. He was thinking about redemption through suffering. He was looking for a crucible. He believed that by subjecting his aging, failing body to the ultimate test, he could purge the shame of the 1912 defeat. He could prove to Wilson, to Taft, to the American people, and most importantly to the ghost of his father, that he was still the strongest man in the world. He was running toward the river of doubt, not to find the river, but to lose himself. He gathered his party, ignored the logistics, and stepped onto the boat that would take him upriver, leaving civilization and sanity behind. The Titan had fallen from the heights of power, and now he was choosing to descend into the underworld. As 1913 turned to 1914, the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition gathered in the dusty frontier towns of Brazil to assemble the machine that would carry them into the unknown. On paper, it was an operation of military precision, backed by the prestige of the American Museum of Natural History and the Brazilian government. It had funding, it had personnel, and it had the most famous man on earth as its figurehead. But beneath the veneer of officialdom, the expedition was a chaotic disaster in the making, a tragedy of errors fueled by arrogance, ignorance, and a fatal underestimation of the Amazon. The seeds of Roosevelt's near suicide were not planted in the jungle. They were sown in the packing crates in New York and the supply depots of Tapirapwa. The first and most critical failure lay in the provisions. The task of outfitting the expedition had fallen to Anthony Fiala, an explorer with a dubious record who had previously lost his ship in the Arctic. Fiala, perhaps dazzled by the celebrity of his patron, packed for a royal picnic rather than a survival mission. The manifest read like a menu for a high society luncheon. There were crates of tinned foie gras, jars of olives, heavy cases of fine mustard, and boxes of applesauce. There were folding chairs and tables, allowing the colonel to dine in civilized comfort. There were heavy reference books and stiff canvas tents. What was missing was the brutal mathematics of survival. Fiala had severely miscalculated the caloric needs of men dragging 1,000-pound boats through the waist-deep mud. He had prioritized variety and taste over energy density. There was a criminal shortage of complex carbohydrates, rice, beans, and dried meat, the unglamorous fuel that keeps the human engine running in the tropics. The luggage was bloated with comforts that would become curses the moment the mules died and the river turned wild. Roosevelt, blinded by his own romantic vision of the trip as a great adventure, failed to audit the supplies. He trusted the experts, and the experts were packing his coffin with gourmet delicacies. Then there was the issue of the boats. In New York, Fiala had commissioned special lightweight Canadian canoes, designed to be durable yet portable. They were marvels of engineering. But through a comedy of logistical errors and the rough travel to the river's headwaters, these vessels were either lost, damaged, or deemed unsuitable for the rough terrain before they even reached the River of Doubt. The expedition was forced to abandon the technology of the 20th century and revert to the Stone Age. They purchased local pirogues, dugout canoes. These were not the sleek, maneuverable crafts of the American North Woods that Roosevelt knew how to paddle. These were leviathans, carved from the solid trunks of massive jungle hardwoods. A single canoe could weigh over 2,000 pounds. They were sluggish, deep-drafted, and impossible to steer in fast water. Worst of all, they were practically immovable on land. If the river had rapids, and Rondon warned that it would have many, the men would have to drag these 1-ton wooden monsters over slippery rocks and through dense underbrush to bypass the falls. It was a physical sentence of hard labor that would have broken young, healthy convicts. For a 55-year-old man with a bad leg and a heart condition, it was a death warrant. But the most complex dynamic of the disaster was the human one. The team that assembled on the banks of the River of Doubt on February 27, 1914, was a volatile mixture of personalities, divided by language, culture, and motivation. At the head stood Colonel Candido Rondon. Short, wiry, and possessed of a fanatical stoicism, Rondon was a positivist who believed in order and progress. He worshipped the jungle with a mystical reverence. For Rondon, the mission was scientific and humanitarian. He insisted on mapping every twist of the river and treating the indigenous tribes with absolute pacifism. Die if you must, but never kill, was his motto regarding the Indians. Opposing him was Theodore Roosevelt. Large, loud, and consumptive TR saw the jungle as an enemy to be conquered. He was impatient with Rondon's meticulous surveying. He wanted speed. He wanted to hunt. He chafed at the delays. The friction between the two leaders, the Brazilian ascetic and the American expansionist, created a tension that vibrated through the camp. Caught in the middle was Kermit Roosevelt. If Theodore was the tragic hero of this story, Kermit was the sacrificial lamb. He had not wanted to come. He was recently engaged, living in Brazil, building a career and a life of his own. But his mother Edith, terrified of her husband's depressive state, had cabled Kermit and guilted him into joining the expedition. "You must go," she wrote, "to take care of your father." Kermit, a man of quiet intelligence and melancholy loyalty, obeyed. He abandoned his fiancée and his job to become his father's guardian. He was the only person who could manage TR's moods, the only one TR would listen to. But Kermit had inherited the Roosevelt fragility along with the Roosevelt name. He was prone to dark moods and lacked the physical robustness of his father's prime. By agreeing to go, he was signing away his own health to protect a man who was subconsciously seeking destruction. Rounding out the American contingent was George Cherry, a naturalist and veteran of 20 South American expeditions. Cherry was a realist. He took one look at the heavy dugouts, the mountains of gourmet food, and the darkening sky, and he knew they were in trouble. He wrote in his diary with grim foresight, noting that the river was too high, the supplies too low, and the party too large. On February 27, 1914, the expedition stood at the edge of the Rio da Dúvida. The water was black, swollen by the rainy season, rushing northward into a wall of green silence. It was the point of no return. Rondon offered a speech, naming the river and dedicating the journey. Roosevelt, dressed in his khakis and pith helmet, looked at the water with a mixture of excitement and grim determination. He wrote his last letters to the outside world, handing them to the support team that would turn back. "We are about to go into the unknown," he wrote. As the heavy dugouts pushed off from the bank, the current grabbed them with terrifying force. The expedition vanished around the first bend, swallowed by the Amazon. Almost immediately, the illusion of a scientific survey evaporated. The gourmet food crates began to break open. The insects descended in a cloud. The first rainstorm hit, soaking them to the bone, a rain that would essentially not stop for 2 months. The map was blank. The radio was left behind to save weight. They were 19 men, drifting on 7 hollowed-out logs, floating toward a destiny that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the breaking point of the human soul. The anatomy of disaster was complete. The body was now ready for the surgery of the jungle. The first week on the River of Doubt was not an exploration. It was a systematic demolition of the romantic ideal of the Amazon. Any lingering Victorian notions Roosevelt held about the majesty of nature were strangled within 48 hours of launching the dugouts. The river did not welcome them. It fought them. It was not a lazy, winding highway into the interior. It was a violent, chaotic staircase of water that seemed determined to smash their primitive vessels into splinters. The expedition had barely lost sight of the telegraph line at Tapirapua when the reality of their logistical failures crashed down upon them. The river was swollen with the relentless rains of the wet season, creating a brown, churning torrent that tore through the jungle at terrifying speeds. But the speed was a trap. The gradient of the land dropped sharply, creating an endless series of cataracts and waterfalls. A modern expedition with lightweight Kevlar canoes might have shot these rapids or carried their boats around them with ease. But Roosevelt's team was piloting the aquatic equivalent of steam locomotives. The daily routine descended into a cycle of back-breaking purgatory. They would paddle for perhaps a mile, fighting the current, only to hear the roar of white water ahead. Rondon, the cautious surveyor, would order a halt. Then the torture began. The men had to unload tons of crates, the heavy boxes of mustard and olive oil, the tents, the scientific equipment, onto the muddy banks. Then, using ropes and brute strength, they had to drag the 2,000-pound dugout canoes overland. This was not walking. It was hacking. They had to cut a path through the green wall of the jungle with machetes, trudging through waist-deep mud, slipping on rotting vegetation, hauling the massive logs inch by inch around the falls. A single portage could take 6 hours. They might travel only 2 miles in a 14-hour day. The physical cost was astronomical. The men were burning 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, but their rations, poorly planned and rapidly dwindling, provided barely half that. They were starving while working the hardest labor of their lives. But the labor was only the exhaustion. The horror came from the air. As they descended deeper into the basin, They entered the domain of the insect. To call them bugs is to diminish the psychological and physical devastation they inflicted. By day, the air was thick with piums, tiny biting flies that swarmed in the clouds. They did not sting. They bit out microscopic chunks of flesh, leaving a bloody pinprick. They targeted the eyes, the nose, the ears, and the wrists. The men's hands became swollen, red mitts. Their faces puffed up into unrecognizable masks of welts. Blood trickled constantly down their necks, staining their khaki shirts. Roosevelt, whose skin was sensitive, suffered immensely. He wore a head net, but the flies found ways inside. He wore thick gauntlets, but the heat was so oppressive, consistently over 90 degrees with 100% humidity, that he would sweat through his clothes in minutes. The sweat attracted more flies. It was a feedback loop of misery. At night, the piums retired and the mosquitoes emerged. These were not the nuisance mosquitoes of Oyster Bay. These were the vectors of malaria and yellow fever. The men slept under nets, but the nets were rotting in the damp air. The humming of the mosquitoes was a constant, high-pitched soundtrack to their insomnia. Sleep became impossible. The men lay in their hammocks, their bodies burning with heat, their skin itching uncontrollably, listening to the jungle breathe. Under this strain, the tension between Roosevelt and Rondon began to fracture. For Rondon, the mission was the map. He stopped constantly to set up his theodolite, to measure angles, to calculate latitude. He was methodical, unhurried, a man of infinite patience. For Roosevelt, every stop was a torture. He saw the food supplies dwindling. He saw the health of the men deteriorating. He wanted to race the river, to dash through the rapids, to get out. He paced the riverbanks while Rondon surveyed, slapping at flies, his famous energy turning into a frantic, caged agitation. He began to realize that Rondon's pace, while scientifically rigorous, was a death sentence for the group's supplies. Then the river claimed its first victory. On March 15th, tragedy struck. The expedition's lead canoe, commanded by Kermit, was caught in a powerful eddy above a waterfall. The heavy dugout was swept out of control. Kermit and his two paddlers were helpless as the massive log broadsided the current and was sucked over the falls. Kermit Roosevelt was thrown into the churning white water. He was a strong swimmer, but the hydraulics of the falls pinned him down. He fought for air, tumbling through the rocks, bruising his ribs, swallowing water. Miraculously, he washed up on a rock island below, gasping and half drowned. But one of the Brazilian porters, a man named Simplicio, was not so lucky. The river took him. They never found his body. He simply vanished into the brown foam. The death of Simplicio cast a pall of doom over the camp. It was the first undeniable proof that the river intended to kill them. They had lost a man. They had lost a canoe. They had lost crates of precious provisions that went down with the boat. Roosevelt looked at his son, battered and shivering on the bank, and the reality of their situation crystallized. This was not a bully adventure. They were trapped. They could not go back upriver. The current was too strong to paddle the heavy dugouts against. They could only go forward, deeper into the unknown, toward more rapids, more hunger, and more death. And in the chaos of that disaster, something else happened. Something small, almost unnoticed, but fatal. During the frantic efforts to secure the remaining boats in the aftermath of the accident, Roosevelt slipped. His leg, the heavy, thick pillar that supported his bulk, slammed against a jagged rock. He grimaced, shook it off, and kept moving. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for the doctor. He was the bull moose. He didn't stop for bruises. But deep inside the tissue of his shin, the bone was bruised and the flesh was mashed. In the septic environment of the Amazon, where every leaf and drop of water teemed with bacteria. That bruise was a ticking time bomb. The gates of misery had closed behind them, and Theodore Roosevelt was already carrying his death warrant in his left leg. By late March 1914, the expedition had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer merely struggling against the geography of the basin. They had trespassed into a war zone. The jungle, which had previously been a mindless, chaotic force of rapids and insects, suddenly acquired a terrifying intelligence. They had entered the territory of the Cide Larga, the Wide Belts, an indigenous tribe known among the rubber tappers only as ghosts who killed without warning. For Theodore Roosevelt, a man who had led cavalry charges against entrenched soldiers and hunted apex predators across the African savanna, this was a new and deeply unsettling form of warfare. There was no enemy to charge. There was no front line. There was only the green wall and the heavy, suffocating certainty that they were being watched. The psychological pressure of the unseen observer began to corrode the group's morale more effectively than the hunger. It started with subtle signs that Rondon, with his experienced eye, pointed out to the oblivious Americans. A broken twig at shoulder height, a footprint in the mud that had not been there an hour before, a strange rhythmic whistling that echoed from the canopy, mimicking a bird but possessing a cadence that was undeniably human. The expedition was moving through a panopticon. They were the specimens in a glass jar, observed by eyes they could not see, judged by a jury that spoke no language they understood. Rondon, staying true to his positivist philosophy of die if you must, but never kill, insisted on leaving gifts for the shadow people. He hung machetes, beads, and cloth on trees at their campsites, peace offerings meant to signal their benevolent intent. But the next morning, the gifts would be gone, and there would be no reciprocity, only the feeling of the noose tightening. Roosevelt found Rondon's pacifism noble, but maddeningly naive. He slept with his Winchester rifle next to his hammock, his hand resting on the stock. He knew that in the logic of the wild, weakness was an invitation to slaughter. The camp settled into a state of paranoid vigilance. Every snap of a dry branch sent hands reaching for holsters. Sleep, already ruined by the mosquitoes, became a series of terrified naps. Then, the threat materialized in a moment of shocking violence that struck at the one thing Roosevelt had left to love in this hell, his dog. Trigueiro was a mongrel, a scruffy, loyal creature that had accompanied the expedition and become a source of comfort for the colonel. In a world where men were turning on each other and hope was vanishing, the dog's wagging tail was a tether to humanity. One afternoon, while the men were laboring over yet another agonizing portage, hauling the dugouts through the mud, Trigueiro bounded ahead into the bamboo thicket, perhaps chasing a scent. There was no bark, no growl of confrontation. There was just a sudden, dull thud, and then silence. When the men pushed through the foliage, they found Trigueiro lying on his side. He was not just dead, he had been executed. 2 long reed arrows tipped with razor-sharp bamboo and smeared with dark poison were driven deep into his body. The angle of the shots suggested they had been fired from close range, likely less than 20 feet. The shooters had been standing right there, invisible in the dappled light, watching the American struggle, choosing to kill the animal as a warning. It was a message written in blood. We are here. We can touch you. You are next. Roosevelt stared down at the body of the dog. The death of Trigueiro shook him deeply. It was a violation of his circle of protection. He realized with a jolt of dread that the only reason he was not lying there with an arrow in his chest was because the Cide Larga had chosen not to kill him yet. The expedition was not surviving by its own strength. It was surviving by the mercy of the people they were invading. The bull moose was not the hunter here. He was the prey. The night following the dog's death was the longest of the journey. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against the canvas of the tents. The jungle, usually a cacophony of nocturnal noise, seemed to hold its breath. The men huddled closer to the fires, their faces gaunt and twitching in the flickering light. They knew that out in the blackness beyond the firelight, the archers were waiting. They could imagine the tension of the bowstrings. The fear was visceral, primal. It stripped away the last vestiges of civilized discipline. This external terror combined with the internal physical collapse to push the group toward a breaking point. They were starving, they were sick, and now they were terrified. The social contract that held the expedition together, the hierarchy of president, colonel, and porter, began to dissolve. If death was waiting in the trees, why follow orders? Why haul the heavy boxes? Why not steal the extra ration of dried meat? The invisible enemy had achieved what the rapids could not. They had broken the psychological cohesion of the group.